I'm here today with Carrie, and she is a life coach. And I guess the first question I have for you, Carrie, is I met you because you joined the Compassion Coalition. And I guess I just want to ask, what motivated you to join?
Okay. Well, so I started, really researching the issues around trans identity and how it's been not only affecting LGB people, that's kind of my point of reference. I come out of that community. And also how the larger impact on women in society at large, essentially. And so as I started to research the issue, in great detail, actually, it just led me to, starting to reach out to all different kinds of groups and from the left to the right, and just connecting with all the different organizations as much as I can, to see where people are at and what people's concerns are and points of view and perspectives. And so I'm just kind of like was in that, information gathering, but also just wanting to connect and hear from other people.
And for those who don't know, the Compassion Coalition is set up specifically to kind of address concerns about the medical transitioning of children who oftentimes have underlying issues that are causing them to assume a trans identity. And actually just recently, the NHS in Britain put forth released some information about concerns that some of the clinicians at their gender identity clinic have had about kids who are being medically transitioned, who are identifying as transgender.
Right.
And their concern is that they're actually homosexual and that these kids are being pushed to transition to
Right.
become so that they look like they're straight kids. And the concern is that this is actually profoundly homophobic and is going to have a huge impact on the LGB community.
Yeah, I mean that's my perspective, for sure. Like I've seen the changes in our community, LGBT community, over the last 20 years. So I came out 20 years ago as a bisexual woman, and at that time the T was just recently added at that point. It was like late 90s, early 2000s when the T started to be added to LGB. And I was, young and in college, and I also was, I would say, really indoctrinated into the trans ideology over time. And the ideology certainly changed. And most notably, about 6 years ago, it was about 2015, 2016, around that time period, they started to tweak the way that they looked at transsexualism. Specifically. And so that was when some red flags started to go off for me, was when I was around young people who were, repeating, saying things to me. It was clear that youth culture has been very indoctrinated with these ideas, way more than my generation was, and even the 30s and 20s. And so that started to raise red flags for me about, years ago. But I wasn't at a point where I was like really, really looking at it. And so actually what really raised the flag for me, what we call like our peak trans, right? I'm sure you've heard that term. And for those who maybe haven't heard that term, it basically just means those of us who were really allies to the trans community, or trans, allies with that group, where we kind of like are like, whoa, that's too much. We've gone too far. And so my peak trans was actually when a friend of mine who was trans identified, a female to male, and so went by trans guy, but was a homosexual and had prior lived as a lesbian and then transitioned. And so that's been a very common trend that we saw really kind of getting going with a lot of speed around 2010. That became more and more common. But even throughout the early 2000s, I mean, some lesbians will talk about how there was almost like a whole disappearance of what we would call butch lesbians, or more masculine presenting, or non-conforming. And like a lot of that group just disappeared, because they transitioned. And so I've seen the impact not only on, the lesbian community, but back to my friend. So my friend committed suicide in 2017. And that was a huge wake-up call, because the trans narrative says that medical transitioning saves lives. that's the antidote to, you know, suicide for people who feel that they're trans. So I was like, okay, well, that didn't save my friend, and what's going on here? And that's what really got me like really thinking about this issue and concerned about it, and concerned for the younger generation in particular.
It's so interesting that you mentioned butch lesbian disappearing, because I just watched a video from a young woman who medically transitioned and is now detransitioning. She's had her breasts removed, she's had her uterus and her ovaries removed, and she's a young woman, and she's lamenting the fact that there are no butch lesbians, and she had no role models.
Yeah.
And so she just assumed, because she had no role models, that she was actually a man, because she was a butch lesbian. And that's heartbreaking to me, that a young woman mutilated her body to such a degree, and now she has basically she's in menopause for the rest of her life. She has to take hormones now, female hormones or male hormones, some kind of hormone, in order to regulate her system, because she's destroyed her ovaries.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, and I think for those of us that have witnessed this development, you know, it's like, it's funny because I listen to, like, you know, researchers this or psychologists this or whoever that, you know, and it's like, you know, they're talking about the pattern, or, oh, it's a new idea that, you know, this is a social issue. And I'm like, no, I've seen it. I literally watched it happen. Like, I witnessed the changes occur. And so it is heart-wrenching that, you know, that young females in particular are being really, really drawn to this movement now. And it's interesting because it's not even just LGB girls or lesbian or bisexual girls. It's straight girls now too.
Right, autistic, girls who've had trauma.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of it is girls who've had sexual trauma, girls who, like most girls in our society, I think, experience discomfort, especially around puberty. You know, it's like all of a sudden you don't get attention from men or boys, and then all of a sudden you do, and it's not comfortable. And then all the things that they tell girls that they can or can't do, I think, you know, really contributes to girls wanting to be a boy. And so,
and the narrative now that you're either a Barbie or a G.I. Joe or somewhere in between, but if you don't conform to very narrow and regressive
very rigid
stereotypes, then it means that you're actually transgender or gender nonconforming, which I didn't realize this, but gender nonconforming has now been usurped under the trans umbrella. So it's like they started out with this very tiny fraction of the population, you know, 0.01% of the population was transsexual 20 years ago. And now the umbrella keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the message keeps getting more and more invasive. So rather than accepting gender nonconformity, there's this increasing push to medically transition kids, and the narrative is they'll kill themselves if you don't medically transition. And at the same time, we're having legislation passed that prohibits therapists from trying to identify potential underlying causes of a trans identity.
Right. Yeah. And it's there's a lot that you said there that I agree with all of that. And the thing is that if we look at the history of transgenderism, you know, pre-transgenderism, the T stood for transsexualism, right? And so, and I don't know exactly when that changed, because it seems like it was fairly recent, because transsexual was the term used originally when it joined the LGB. And so at some point, I think in the last 10, maybe 15 years, that started to shift. And, you know, part of the logic I heard coming from trans people themselves was, oh, well, we don't necessarily want to say transsexual, because then it triggers people to think about their genitalia, right? I'm like, oh, well, okay, yeah. So that was kind of like the first thing I heard. And I was like, oh, yeah, I kind of get that. I know what you mean. That's kind of that is kind of uncomfortable, because, yeah. So, okay, you're transgender. I'll go along with that. Okay, I got it, you know? So, like, that's kind of how they sold it to us, was, oh, this is kind of an awkward thing to talk about, so we'll just make this nicer, fluffier word instead, right? And so, but transsexualism was, you know, that was the original T, and transgenderism came along, and it came along in big force, and it came along with an ideology. Because the original transsexuals were very aware that they were what they were. They were either male or female, and they were going toward the other sex, which is, you know, obviously impossible. But that was the idea, flawed as it is, right?
It
It's
was very clear in their mind. They didn't ever try to usurp the other sex. They were very clear that they were one sex and they
right,
were wanting to present as the other sex.
right, right. And so one of the shifts that happened that was part of the wake up call for me was, you know, they used to say sex at birth. That was the phrase, and that comes from the intersex. That comes from the history of intersex, and where really it's more like sex observed at birth is really more accurate. But
Or recorded or
yeah, but so out of the intersex language, the trans ideology borrowed, you know, sex assigned at birth. Sex assigned. Okay, so assigned, I don't know, whatever. But the point is that changed. That the ideology changed from the identifying sex as being the key word and the key issue, right? Transsexual, right? To gender assigned at birth. Gender assigned at birth. So when I was having conversations with young people who were like 18, 19 years old a few years ago, and they started saying that to me, I was like, gender? Huh. Okay, that's new, because I actually
what does that even mean, really?
correct.
I mean,
Exactly. But I also I had worked with, this is how indoctrinated I was, is that I actually had run some workshops about transgenderism, transsexualism with some trans people. So you know, I really knew the ins and outs of what they were communicating, their strategy, their way of thinking. But that was a big change, because only in 2014, when I did those trans workshops, were we talking about sex assigned at birth. And then they change it to gender assigned at birth. And that's where it gets so murky. It just gets so blurry and so murky that, you know, you've got, and I was like talking to these young people, and I was like, well, where do you think, what are they basing the gender off of, guys? Like, what do you think is going on there? And it was like these teenagers, they just couldn't get it.
well, the ideology has gotten so strange that I've been watching these videos from various universities that are teaching about LGBTQ issues, and they're actually almost mocking biology, as though anybody who accepts biology is kind of, you know, silly or misinformed. Or so you have been in the LGBT community for much of your life.
Yes.
How are people within the community navigating what's going on? At least with, you know, what you're familiar with.
This is so hard. I mean, I can just speak to a couple of recent developments, which you're probably aware of, but maybe your audience isn't. So early this year, maybe end of last year, in the UK, you know, Stonewall was like the big organization, and there was a political split in that organization because the LGBs were like, this doesn't represent us anymore. You know, this isn't our organization anymore. And you know, lesbians have been complaining about this for decades, about between the sexism and the misogyny and trying to work with gay men, and then the trans coming in, trumping in and telling women that they have to now, lesbians have to now be open to having sex with
biological males who identify as women.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so there's been a lot of silencing of lesbians, and it's unfortunately not a new thing, but politically it's really been an issue for a long time. So anyway, the LGBT people of Stonewall were like, we're done, this is not our organization anymore, and there was a big political split. And that's the first one that I'm aware of that's occurred, which I think is a really good sign, actually. So that split occurred, and then they broke off, and they're creating LGB Alliance, I believe is what it's called. And so after that happened, I was like, finally, people in the LGBT community are waking up to this, you know. And I think people have been for a long time. I think it depends on how close in contact they've been, especially with younger generations, to I have been, you know, I mentored youth in my 20s. I worked for the YMCA around youth programs. So and I've always just maintained relationships with young people and mentoring and all that. And also being in the LGBT community, well, really LGBT, because there was a big element of the T, right? All of my housing situations have almost exclusively been with LGBT people. And so for 20 years, I've just seen how each generation has kind of gone more and more down that road of seeing women who I would interpret as being, you know, lesbians, like big, you know, powerful women and big voices and had things to contribute, all of a sudden shifting into I want to be non-binary, or I don't want to use female pronouns anymore. And just this, and that's not really new. Like if you look at our community, even when I was young, you know, there was like discussions about femme visibility, like, you know, the femmes are being erased, and there's been a trend toward kind of romanticizing masculinity for whatever that means. That's another conversation, but yeah, so there's already been kind of a trend of celebrating women who are on the more masculine end of things. Like to fit into the community, you basically had to like chop your hair off and not look, not, you know, which is like ridiculous because hair doesn't define us. It doesn't define who we are or anything, you know? So yeah, so I've seen this trend it got intensified from butch women being kind of more acceptable, you know, kind of a style, being more visible, being more desired in some cases. And then now younger women, 25-year-olds being like, I'm a non-binary now, or use masculine pronouns for me, or I'm gender non-conforming, or, you know, I'm trans. It's just gone more and more and more.
Well, and the interesting thing to me is that what I'm really seeing is a push almost to get rid of the LGB, because a lot of trans activists are saying that anybody who's lesbian, gay, or bisexual is basing their sexual attraction on genitals, which is actually transphobic. And I have, you know, this is something that I keep hearing in the trans community, that you know, if you know, and you mentioned it, there's something called the cotton ceiling, and it's the idea that, you know, if a trans man, trans identified man, a man who believes he feels like a woman, can have sex with a lesbian, that's breaking the cotton ceiling. It's getting into her panties, basically. I mean, it's very crude language, but a lot of trans activists I've seen have been attacking gay men more and more for being being gender or genital centered.
Yeah.
I mean, it's even hard to talk about because it gets so convoluted, but the message almost is to get rid of the LGB, and you can really see that now with the push towards the Q, which, you know, is queer, which is supposed to be this umbrella term that accepts everybody, but in fact it really is anybody who just accepts the trans narrative. But I even just recently saw that you know, when I was younger, they had gay straight alliances, and I just read that they're no longer called gay straight alliances. They're now called gender sexuality alliances. So they're just sort of, they keep kind of appropriating more and more of the LGB culture and almost shaming people who are genital specific in their sexual attractions.
Right. I mean, it comes back to what is the definition of homosexuality? It's not based on your gender identity, whatever the heck that means. It's based on your biology. It's, you know, two of the same or one of each opposites. Like that's what it comes down to. And so it's literally a redefinition of what homosexuality is. I mean, that's what's going on. And that's why kids are really confused, because they literally think that gender identity trumps your actual biology. I mean, that's what they think is going on. So if I identify this way, that determines my sexual orientation rather than my body determines my sexual orientation. So yeah, it is an erasure of homosexuals, essentially. But yeah, and I think the thing is, it's interesting because in the past, it was like gay men, I think, weren't really feeling this that much. Generally.
I don't think so. I think it's been pretty recently that all of a sudden there's some pressure on them. And that's why I think people are starting to, you know, it's all of a sudden.
Yeah, it is, because lesbians have been feeling this for a long time. And the thing is that it's not even that, I mean, when we talk about who are trans identified people, there's so many different categories. Like that could probably take 20 minutes just to break down all the different groups of people. But from my experience, having been in the LGBT community for so long, the majority of people, at least until very recently, before it became a big trend, the trans trend blew up, prior to that, I mean, I'm talking maybe only 5 to 10 years ago, the majority of those people were LGB. The majority were absolutely LGB people. And they, you know, so most of the transsexuals that I've ever known that were male to female were either gay or bisexual. I think actually more bisexuals, but that's just my own personal experience. And I think the part of the reason is because bisexuality, and this isn't talked a lot, but there's, you know, bisexuality, we kind of get hit on both sides. If I'm really
You're not really included
oh,
in either group.
We are politically, and we are in community, we are included. But the thing is that there's a lot of, you know, it's kind of like, oh, you're not gay enough, or, oh, you're really just straight, or, you know, right, there's a lot of that. So we kind of get it from both homosexuals and heterosexuals. But yeah, I think that for men in particular, bisexual men in particular, they get hit differently than bisexual women, because bisexual women were more like, straight men will say, oh, that means we get to have a threesome, right? No. No, what? No. No, like, you know, so like we get hit in different ways. Like bisexual women are more like eroticized, and, you know, it's a different experience, at least from men, that's how we get treated. And then from lesbians, it's suspicious. They're a little suspicious of us, and rightfully so to some extent, but egos get hurt, you know, on both sides. Well, she left me for a man, you know. It must have not been me. It was really just her, right? I mean, there's like a lot of ego involved in this. But bisexual men in particular get a different hit in terms of what they experience. And I think what they get is they, like, straight women don't want to date bisexual men because of AIDS, you know, because of fear around disease, especially, you know, 10 years ago in the 90s and the 2000s. So that limits their dating pool, these bisexual men, right? Because if they tell straight women, straight women are like, oh, no, I don't, right? And so they experience homophobia from straight women. Then they also get homophobia from heterosexual men, of course. Oh, what? You mess with guys? Like, right? So they really get hit in a different way than bisexual women do. And I think from the gay community, you know, I think the same kind of thing where gay men are like, how could you like women? Because there's also like kind of a lot of misogyny going on in gay male culture, which should be apparent by now for anyone who's been paying attention. But you know that it's, yeah, I mean, gay men want to be exclusively around other gay men, which is understandable.
And I haven't seen a lot of women who are identifying as men pushing into the gay men communities the way I see men who are identifying as women pushing into women's spaces. And part of that might just be that that women who transition are just, they're just trying to live their lives. I feel like there's a lot of bullying among trans men who are identifying as women, and that's part of the difference that I'm seeing too, is, at least from my perspective, that I think that there are a lot of men who are identifying as transgender, not because they're transgender, but because it's an opportunity to assume this identity and to infiltrate women's communities and to kind of bully women. And I'm not saying that's true of all men who are identifying as women, but I'm seeing, it seems like an increasing number of men who really are sort of feeling sorry for themselves and are using this as a way to sort of gain some power. It also allows them to kind of cast off the label of the oppressor as being the the white male. Now all of a sudden they're a woman, and a trans woman at that. So they're marginalized now. So it's a way for them. So it's sort of that's what I've seen, is that even two, and maybe I just haven't been very aware, but it seems like with the self-ID movement, which for people who don't know, self-identification is the idea that anybody should be able to identify as any sex that they want. And that's when that started getting pushed, that's when I started seeing more and more what I would consider straight men identifying as women.
Yeah. I mean, I think I'll summarize that in a very short way, right? Is that that these males who are identifying as women, right? So there's a huge difference between them and females identifying as men. So like the females who are identifying as men, they want to identify out of sex-based oppression. They want to get out of oppression. And the men who are now, or the males who are identifying as women, want to identify into sex-based oppression, to claim a oppressed status, a marginalized status, because also in activist circles on the left, you know, it's like, there's been a culture of, you know, the most oppressed get to have the loudest voices. And so now here it comes, like, you know, white male is now a trans woman, and now, oh yes, please speak
the
to
most
us,
marginalized
about it. Yeah, most are marginalized, right? So yeah, I think that's definitely been a shift. But again, I think that population of males is a fairly new addition. They came with the transgenders. They came in the 2015 period. Like I agree that that's like a huge group of males now who are coming in this movement, and why it's become such a dangerous movement. They are the reason why it's become such a dangerous movement, because the discussion changed from sex to gender. That's why it became so dangerous, that they can just identify however they want, and that's that, and we're all supposed to accept it. So I think though, but that's not been my experience. Like actually in the LGBT community, it's been like a little creeping in of those men. And I think a lot of us have, and I think for young people, actually for younger women, it's raised flags. Like that has raised flags that, oh, now they get the loudest voice. Like, okay, but they still embody everything about, you know, a male that any other guy does, no matter how they identify. So I don't see how they're really that different. So that actually has woken up some of the younger women and younger generations of the LGBT community. But I would say for the most part, that has not been our experience as a LGBT group. Like I said, most of the trans people I've known have been homosexual or bisexual themselves. Yeah.
So do you work with children at all, or do you primarily work with adults?
Teens.
So have you had teens that come in who have detransitioned?
Not yet, no. So this is a fairly new business for me. I come out of, I'm a social worker, and I went from kind of micro social work into macro social work, and that's where my political background comes from. And so, because I was a political organizer for 15 years, I had a career as a political organizer, working on all kinds of issues, electoral and issue-based campaigns. So my whole thing is like, it's always been a fusion of psychology and sociology, and looking at how the individual experience, the interpersonal experience relates to the collective dynamic and the collective social experience, right? So that's always been my two main interests. And so now this is kind of like a return for me out of the real political realm back into like working with people individually. And what drove me to do this, you know, become a life coach. And my life coaching is specifically for teens who identify as trans. And I created that specifically because I'm concerned about young people and LGB young people, but all young people, because it's not just LGB kids getting pulled into this, like I said, you know, and the thing is that, you know, because I come out of the community, I know the theory, I know the history, I know the backstory to all of this, and the kids don't. They have no idea. They have no idea.
Well, and I think a lot of, especially I think about girls on the autism spectrum who have rigid, you know, part of that autism diagnosis is rigid thinking and also perseverating on things. And so they're sort of like the perfect, I'm going to call them victims for this ideology, because a lot of times they are gender nonconforming. They're what I would consider geeky girls, which is what I was as a kid. I have had people suggest I'm on the spectrum because I would get super excited about number patterns, which is not something most girls do. You know, I used to love to read science fiction, which is not something most girls do. And those are things that a lot of girls who are on the spectrum tend to gravitate towards. They tend to be very, they don't have as good of social skills as the other girls. And so it seems like they're easy pickings for someone to say, oh, you know why you're struggling? It's because you're actually a man. And to me, that is really so sad, because these are the girls that we need. These are going to be like the Temple Grandins of of this generation, the girls who are going to be the scientists and innovators, are being told that they're actually boys, and that makes me really sad.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, it's just, there's so many layers to this.
So when you
know?
talk to these kids,
Yeah.
do they just go, why? Or are they like, I don't know about you?
No. I mean, no, it disarms them immediately when I tell them I come out of the LGBT community. Immediately their guards go down. And they, because now, like you mentioned earlier, there's these different laws that restrict therapists from talking about certain things, right? So like they created there's these laws about that you basically, therapists must use the trans affirming identity approach, right? Which is not founded on anything other than
it's so disturbing to me.
It's literally the best practices manual that somebody wrote and decided this is the best practice and then sent it around.
And for those who don't know, I just want to clarify, because a lot of people are really confused about what conversion therapy means. These conversion therapy bans, they came from a good place.
Yeah.
The idea was that they wanted to prevent things like electroshock therapy and ice pick lobotomies, things that are incredibly invasive, that at one point were used on the LGB communities. And of course, we definitely want those banned. And in fact, they are. I mean, they already are. The APA would never allow that. But what they've now done is they've brought in this transgender thing, and they're saying that therapists have to affirm behaviors, beliefs, and thoughts that are transgender, which is basically everything. So like when I was a trans kid, if I went to a therapist, the therapist couldn't have said, is there anything that might have caused you to believe you're a boy? Because that would be challenging my belief that I was transgender. So therapists are now very, very limited in how they can work with kids who identify as transgender, and they really do have to affirm it. And so I'm hoping there are going to be more people like you who come in as life coaches who aren't going to be under that umbrella, who can work with these kids. So you're really providing a very critical service.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I felt like there is a group of therapists who are not on the gender affirming trans train, but it's a small group and it's a limited group, and it's also not necessarily so easy for parents to find them. It's pretty hard. So that's kind of why I'm like, okay, I'm going to be a bit more vocal. And the activist in me is like, I got to find people and let people know that like there's an alternative. Like, because I think for parents, who have no idea of any of this political developments and how it's influenced culture, this whole movement has influenced culture, like they're just like out of nowhere, their kids saying, I think I'm a boy or I think I'm a girl, and they're like, what? I mean, it's like, but for me, like I totally get it because I've seen it develop. And so yeah, I don't come at kids like immediately saying, no, you're not this or that. Like that's not what I'm doing. I'm working with them to, like you said, that there are underlying issues going on with the vast majority of these kids. There are other things that need to be addressed. There's, traumas and, other things happening with them that they need to work through. And I do feel like this trans identity is, for most teenagers, it's a projection of all the things that they don't like about themselves, the things that they're uncomfortable with, the difficult experiences they've had, all that stuff. And they just project it onto this trans identity. And that becomes the focus. And there's also these, like, a very common pattern with trans people is they have this anxiety loop that just plays over and over and over again. And they obsess about it, being trans. It's like, I've seen it over and over again, and so not all the teens are at that point, right? But they do get there. That happens the further that they get into it. And oh, now I need to do this surgery. Oh, now I need this thing, or that wasn't enough. And right. And so there's this whole thing of, well, am I passing it? Is this the right way to behave? And right. There's all this stuff that goes into it. And so rather than dealing with, their family dynamics or how they're being treated in society or their own issues, whether they're physical or mental or emotional, therapists are just going along really a lot, or really just
and a lot of times they're legally mandated too.
Yeah.
And I think that what you said is so critical, because I as I'm thinking about that, as you're a teenage kid, you know, with all the heaviness of being a teenager, especially if you're a little bit weird or different or not quite fitting in,
Right.
if you can like project that and just focus on something else, you know, that's what coping mechanisms are. They allow you to like, oh, I don't have to look at me because I'm busy focusing on this other
Yeah.
thing. I'm going to put all my energy and efforts into that. That way I don't have to really look at me. And
Yeah.
I think about, I mean, that's exactly what I was doing when I had a trans identity. It was, you know, I'm not a girl. I'm
Yeah.
not a girl.
Yeah.
Okay, why would you think I'm a girl? I'm going to be a boy. And I put so much energy into like looking at watching the boys, you know, trying to emulate the boys, trying to, you know, really nail it. And that was a long time ago, before any of this was even, you know, in the news, before, you know, there were groups to support this. And so, and it was 100% a coping mechanism in my case. And so
Yeah.
when you say that, you know, I could, you know, see that as just, you know, some of the interviews that I've seen from both teenagers and adults who talk about it as they were, you know, almost like dissociating from themselves,
It
that
is.
it allowed them to just say, you know, I don't have to deal with that other person. I'm going to be this person, and I get to tell people what my name is and how to treat me and what my pronouns
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, my view is that this is an identity disorder. This is not a, I don't, I mean, yeah, there might be, you know, dysmorphia or, you know, but I mean, the whole DSM, like there's so many problems with the DSM all around, in my opinion. And, you know, what it is, if people don't really know, is that it essentially is the insurance Bible for practitioners, that it literally is the coding mechanism of which they bill insurance companies. That is literally what it is for. And so they have to create little you know, the criteria for each diagnosis and blah blah blah.
And that's one of the things the trans movement is going to really run into. They're going to have a problem at some point, I think, because they're insisting that being transgender is not a diagnosis, that it's a normal developmental path, and yet they want to be able to get treatment for it.
Right.
And so
no, they don't want treatment for it. They want it to be paid for.
Right.
That's what they
Right. They want, you know, these incredibly expensive interventions that will end up making them dependent on these interventions. And I can't think of any other case where um, where there isn't a diagnosis, and yet healthcare providers are told that they have to provide the exact type of medical care that a patient wants, that will change their external appearance and harm their bodies. I mean, it's to me, it's a really disturbing, and it almost seems to undermine the whole trans narrative. If we are going to accept that somebody who says that they're you know, a man who says they're a woman is actually a woman, then there really is no such thing as transgender. You know, what kids need right now is some really good role models, I think, and especially girls. And that's one of the things that I've been really disheartened by. And I don't know what your perspective is on this, but when I think about the 70s, and there was this push to, you know, girls could play with Legos, and girls could play with guns, and boys could cook, and they could, you know, do flower arrangements. And there was this, you know, it was this idea that we're really going to break down these gender stereotypes.
Right.
And then it seems like, I'm not sure when it happened, but now when I look at it, it seems like the gender stereotypes are back with a vengeance. And if I were a girl growing up today, I mean, it was hard enough when I grew up, you know, in the 80s and 90s. You know, it was hard enough, but it seems like now they're even those ideas about what you're supposed to look like, you know, makeup and sexy clothing, and, you know, wanting to be sexually active at a young age, all these like messages. It just seems like I can't figure out how we got here, because it seems like we were kind of on the right path, and then we just got like thrown off. And now I just feel like we're almost in a worse place than we were before the 70s, and that whole idea of challenging the gender norms.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I agree. I think we are in a worse place because, I mean, the fact that kids, you know, I mean, teenagehood is hard no matter what kid you are. I mean, it's difficult, it's uncomfortable, it's physically, socially, emotionally. I mean, between the hormones pumping and raging and society, it's like, it's really hard. It's a really hard time period for kids, you know? And I mean, really that like 15 to 20 or even 14, I mean, that's a hard age. So much is changing for them. And and I feel like people aren't explaining to them, like, hey, look, like that's part of what I do is like, look, this is what's happening when you're getting that emotion. Like you're being flooded with chemicals and hormones in your body. And so I explain like these basic ideas to kids so they get it, that like, this is an awkward period. Like you're supposed to feel uncomfortable in your body. Your body is rapidly changing. So is your social condition, you switching from middle school into high school, huge difference. So
and
much.
all the developmental changes too. The brain's developing.
Yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to say is that one of the reasons I think when we talk about kids, and you mentioned like autistic, girls being, you said victims, I think vulnerable. I think teenagers are really, really vulnerable to transgender ideology and the transgender movement, because one, as a teenager, when your brain is developing, you're starting to be able to grasp concepts, which children literally cannot do that at younger ages. And this is one reason why I love working with teenagers, because
I love teenagers too.
I always love teenagers because they're starting to look at the world. They're starting to look at how they fit into it. They're starting to be able to have an analysis and be able to conceptualize things and look at society where they weren't able to do that before. So they're kind of like opening their eyes and like looking around going, what's going on in society and what's happening here? But because this movement is telling them, if you don't perfectly align with, if you're a girl wanting to wear makeup, wear heels and dress sexy, or, if you're not fitting that automatically means that you're a boy, because that's what the dichotomy that the trans movement has set up. So they created that term cisgender, I'm sure you're aware. And that was what really bugged me, actually. That was kind of one of the early red flags for me, was they said, cisgender. So basically, if you don't 100% align with gender stereotypes or norms, you must be trans. But that wasn't how it first started. That's the thing. That cisgender term came along later down the road.
And I'm guessing both of you and I would not, I don't consider myself cisgender at all. Like I reject that.
It's a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. And I think that if you talk to any women in society, they will tell you how they didn't conform in one way or another to some expectation. And men too. That's the other thing. Like, I feel like the conversation is a lot about, women's experiences and the threat of our spaces being invaded and all of that too. But men feel it too. You talk to men about what they are expected to do and what they think that they have to do or how they have to behave. Like, men feel it too. It's not just women.
It's interesting you say that, because I have a son, and the first day of kindergarten, he came home crying. And he was really upset. And I said, honey, what is wrong? Yeah. And he said, I hate pink. And I'm like, okay. You want to talk about that? And I guess he got teased because he was using a pink crayon his first day of kindergarten. And so, this was a while ago, but I'm just thinking, wow, how is it that that's still being talked about? And now that first day of kindergarten, he grabs that pink crayon. He's going to be told, oh, looks like maybe you're a girl. So how heartbreaking is that?
I know. And that's the thing. That's why I'm saying that these young people are really vulnerable, because of course, most humans in Western society, whether you're male or female or boy or girl, you're not going to agree with all the things that they tell you you're supposed to do. Like, you're not going to go along with it 100%.
I know. I'm like, where is this cisgender person? Like, I want to meet them. Is there one?
They are the epitome of a stereotype.
Right.
They are. And that's what bothered me when I first heard that term. I was like, cisgender. And I was like 100% aligning with the gender of my sex or whatever. And I was like, I never felt that way. Like, as a bisexual woman, like I was gender nonconforming as a teenager, and I've never gone along with all the things. I don't do hair. I don't do makeup. I've never done makeup. My mom was a hippie. That's probably part of it. But, like, I don't wear heels. I'm not ever going to, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it. So, like, I don't identify with that stuff. I wasn't a girly girl.
And you should still be able to be considered completely and 100% a woman.
I am, of course. I'm a bisexual woman, but it's like I remember when I was young, right? And the word queer was happening in the 2000s. Like, that was around. The T and the Q are basically the same thing. And I just wanted to, from the trans ideology version, trans is the umbrella term. So it used to be transsexual, then they changed it to transgender, and under transgender there's like 20 different labels that they put under there. And that's so many. I mean, from
everybody who is not cis.
Yeah, but even before, I mean, well, yeah, not cis, but anybody who's like men who like to wear women's underwear, they fall under the trans umbrella. Okay, drag queens fall under the trans umbrella. Anybody who like doesn't just, you know, any woman who wears male clothes, right? Like all these things, like tons of labels now under that umbrella. And the Q is kind of like, I think that, you know, the Q is basically the same idea.
I almost see the Q as being like a virtue signal. Like for me, I could say I'm Q because I did have some lesbian experiences when I was younger. And so
short hair.
I'm Q.
You have short hair, so that therefore.
Yeah, I have short hair. Yeah. I don't generally wear makeup, and I do wear men's shoes almost exclusively. So I'm Q. And so now I'm part of the LGBTQ family.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's really simple. That's really how it's become. Yeah. I mean, there's even like transsexuals, like old school transsexuals are like against this because they're like, we knew what we knew. I mean, I still think there's some problems there, you know, but again, underlying issues that make people think or want to be the opposite sex. But I think a lot of it is rooted in homophobia for those people. A lot of it is rooted in just, you know, I mean, why can't, I mean, that's the thing that's so frustrating is like, I mean, I think a lot of people in the LGBT community have always felt like, well, yeah, people should be able to dress and do whatever they want and have their hair and like, it doesn't matter. That's not who you are. That's just how you dress yourself up. You know, that's how you.
Well, and my big concern, even among older transsexuals, you know, men like Walt Heyer and Billy Burley and some of these people who are coming out who went through the whole sex change operation, a lot of them are now talking about the fact that much of those trans feelings are rooted in early childhood trauma, oftentimes sexual abuse. Yeah. And so it's almost like we as a society are not treating children for trauma and sexual abuse, some really serious things that need treatment. We are glossing over that and encouraging them to accept this as a coping mechanism and celebrating it, which to me is just a tremendous disservice to these kids who are not going to get the appropriate therapy that they need to work through the feelings that they have as a result of that trauma.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big one. I mean, that's one of those things that people don't want to talk about. And I think that the right, the conservatives have been more vocal about sexual abuse, child abuse, pedophilia. And the left is just like, I don't want to see it. I don't want it. Nope. We don't know. That's not real. I mean, I've really seen that, you know, and more as I've researched and gone into these, you know, these different cultural trends and these different ideologies is like, oh boy, the left does not want to look at that. And the thing is like, you know, molestation was fairly a normal practice. I mean, for I think a while now. There's been really not so good sexual boundaries between adults and children.
No, and I think even more so, and that's actually one of the things that really got me most concerned about the trans narrative is that I feel like it's undermining girls' ability to consent if they're told that they have to accept biological males in spaces where they're vulnerable. That not only do they have to accept it, but if they don't like it, they're transphobic. To me, that undermines a girl's ability to consent at, you know, a very early age. So this is happening in elementary school. Yeah. And so to me, that's like such a red flag. I'm like, anytime you tell a girl that she is a bigot for being uncomfortable with protecting her boundaries, that's going to undermine her ability to have those boundaries in other situations.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think we see in the UK, right, where they changed the laws where they were letting boys into the girls' bathrooms. And what happened was the girls started getting urinary tract infections because they wouldn't go pee. They didn't want to go pee because they were so freaked out the boys were going to be in there. I mean, oh my gosh. And if for anybody to think back to the period of being like, I don't know, 3rd through 8th grade, I mean, it was already completely awkward between locker rooms and bathrooms and having to pee next to other girls or like girls peeking over the stalls or under the stalls. I mean, girls were already doing creepy things to each other and humiliating.
So true.
Right?
So true.
terrifying. I hated locker rooms. I don't want to. No, I don't want to be around all these people seeing me naked. No, or like I don't want to have them hear me pee. Like get out of here, you know. So like I'm like, oh my god, that was such a horrific experience with just girls. To now throw in having males in there with the girls, not cool. Not cool.
And then, you know, a lot of the girls, when they start their periods, they were staying home from school, because they were so uncomfortable going to the bathrooms when they're having their periods, when there were boys in there, which just reminds me of these, you know, horrible situations in third world countries where girls are staying home from school when they're menstruating. And now that's happening in, you know, in the UK and potentially in the US because we're not protecting those spaces.
Right. Yeah, and it's such a strange thing because from my perspective, prior to my kind of awakening, right, was like trans people I knew would talk about the bathroom problem, and they would say, "We just do want to be able to go and pee," and I was like, "Well, yeah, okay." So it was like another one of those cases where I was like, "Okay, that makes sense."
Well, and I totally, yeah, I was completely on board with that. I actually wrote a letter to the editor a while ago supporting the idea that, of course, they should be allowed into the bathrooms to pee because it was before all this.
Yeah.
ID where anybody could claim to be anything they wanted to be.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think that it's like that slippery slope where, you know, I mean, it's one thing. I had this experience, right, where, like I said, I've had, you know, transsexual friends who were, you know, male, and it's like, it's one thing to like be in a restroom and you can see that person like has grown breasts, or, you know, and they're not, you know, they're in the bathroom, but they're not they're minding their own business. Right? Okay. So, but problem is, it's like when you don't know that person, that's the problem. It's like on an individual basis, it's like when you know the person, you're like, okay, yeah, we can go pee in the same bathroom together. That's different because you know that person already. You know they're not gonna violate you or try to harm you or hurt other kids in the bathroom, you know? Because it's like in women's bathrooms, it's both children, it's both sexes. It's not just girls in those bathrooms, it's boys and girls in those bathrooms with their mothers. So, you know, it's like, but when it's a stranger and they're clearly a male, that's a very different experience when you don't know that person. And the problem is like, yeah, I can have as much compassion, empathy for somebody who identifies as transsexual and is going through the process or whatever. But the reality is like, we don't know you. Women don't know you. And
well, and if you're a biologically intact male, a lot of women have had very bad experiences. We've been violated. And so
even if they're not a biologically intact male, the thing is that very few males, when they transition, pass. Very, very few. I mean, if we're talking about a minority of the population identifies as trans, and then another minority of the population that is actually transsexual, even of that group, they might have just been on hormones, right? Like, it doesn't matter whether or not what their plumbing is exactly. The fact is, we can tell.
Well, and it's funny because I was actually at the Capitol lobbying for some of these issues, and all of the stalls in the women's bathroom were full, and I needed to change because I had, you know, driven down. I needed to change into I call them lobby clothes because you know.
I know it, yeah.
So I was in the women's bathroom and I was getting undressed, and out of one of the stalls walks a man, and it really threw me.
Yeah.
And even though I am aware of these issues, it's still, I just was like, like, I mean, and I'm not a prude. You know?
It's not the issue. It's that.
But it just, I felt so violated. I was like, here, you know, and so when people say, you know, all these trans people want to do is pee, there's a lot more that goes on in bathrooms than just peeing.
For females.
For females. Yeah, maybe for males, I don't know.
That's the thing. And it's funny, I watched a little clip of one of your interviews. Oh gosh, what was her? Miriam? Yeah, and she said, well, if they were really women, they would know why it's a problem to have males.
Exactly. Yeah, if they really knew what it felt like to be a woman, they would know why.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just, yeah, and I had all that. I'm a very empathetic person. I'm very compassionate. So like when I heard people's stories that were identifying as trans, like, oh yeah, okay, you know, I get it, you know, but I didn't get the ramifications, the broad implications. And it wasn't until things were popping off in Canada and in the UK, I was like, oh my gosh, these policy changes are really creating havoc and harm.
And I believe that that's what's happened with a lot of people is, you know, they're kind, they're loving, they're empathetic, you know, they have a kind heart, and they had no idea how this was going to play out. And now we're seeing the results of it, and it's almost like trying to catch a runaway train. It's, you know, these policies are already in place, and now we're having to deal with the repercussions, such as girls having to compete against biological males in women's sports. You know, these that, you know, 10 years ago, I don't think anybody would have even thought was possible. They would have said, oh, you're just being silly, you're just transphobic, you know, that'll never happen. Well, now it's happening, and I don't know how to stop that train.
Yeah, I think it'll happen. I think it's just a matter of time. I think enough people are going to realize that there's a real problem.
Yeah.
Like, there was a real reason why the sexes were separated for various reasons originally.
Yeah. Well, we fought hard for those, for sex segregated spaces.
Yeah.
So as we're finishing up, is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
I just wanted to kind of go back to some of these laws for a second, around what licensed practitioners can and can't do. So there's two different things, right? There's the gender affirming model that is in some laws, and then there's, like you said, the conversion therapy. And so I just wanted to split those apart for a second.
Because right now they're generally talked about as the same thing, and they're generally introduced in legislation as the same thing.
Yes, but they're not. And the thing is that, and that's why the LGB needs to split from the T, because these are really distinct issues. And so the conversion therapy goes back to how homosexuals and bisexuals are being, you know, treated by, you know, pastors and counselors and everybody, right? Like different.
Some incredibly abusive things happened.
Yeah, it's like it's to convert them to be straight. That's what this is. But if we look at what transgenderism is doing, it's doing that. Transgenderism is gay conversion therapy. If you look at Iran, for example, they have laws where you can transition. They pay for, the government pay for transition.
I think sometimes you're required to transition. If you're gay, they make you transition.
Yes, exactly. So transgenderism is gay conversion therapy, but the way that the laws are being presented, and it's what I find really frustrating, and I've actually been looking more and more into these policies as well, and also the movement to push back against these policies, to get rid of these policies, because they need to be separated. The gender issues and the sexual orientation, they need to be separate. You cannot use the same language for one as the other. And I see that both problematic in the legislation and the activism around trying to change the legislation. There's still that problem. Like, we have to split from it. So I think one of the other things was, is that going back to the LGB movement and the split that happened in the UK. So since that, there has been more of a move of LGBT people starting to get together and talk about how the transgender movement has affected our community. And because it has in so many ways. So I personally started a LGB group specifically to deal and talk about these issues and how it's affected us, and, you know, what our concerns are, and why we have different political interests than the T, and how the T has, you know, basically, like you mentioned earlier, like, took a lot of stuff from our movement and our language and our experience and co-opted it for something that's completely different.
And I'm worried there's going to be a huge backlash against the LGB communities because
there already
of it.
There already has been. I mean, it's like, you know, definitely in more of the right wing, where there's, you know, less acceptance of homosexuality, they because we're all lumped together, it's like fueling the fire and the hatred toward, you know, us as a group. And so, you know, there is like a segment of the LGBT community that's starting to get together, you know, and is starting to look at this and is concerned about the medical transitioning of children. And a lot of the detransitioners, and I think I checked Reddit the other day, and it was like 12,000 people in that group alone. I mean, the detransition movement is going to be huge. And it's sad. It's really sad, because it's permanent damage to people's bodies, you know, and, you know, at least for people to know that there are LGBT people out there that we're not represented when they say the LGBT. They're not representing me. When they talk about, you know, pushing the transgender ideology and affirming all of it, like, no, they're not talking about me. they don't represent me. And I think that there's a lot of me's out there. There's a lot of us out there, more and more, that are like, no, that's not it for us. And so I'm just kind of tired of having, you know, my community being used as the, you know, the piggyback for this other thing that has nothing to do with us really, except that we've been, you know, swept up in it. You know, so it's a complicated issue, but basically, yeah, I think when it comes to working with teens, I think that, you know, it's a gentle process with teenagers, like anything, and it's starting to kind of like challenge their ideas around gender and help them open up and explore those concepts and those feelings and their own experiences and put words to it.
Well, and like you said, just offer them a different perspective, because right now they're being told, you know, one thing, that it, you know, that they're inherently flawed, they're born in the wrong body because they don't conform to rigid gender stereotypes. And so you're offering them just a different perspective, a much healthier perspective.
Not just a different perspective, because it's not like I go on and on about myself all day long, but I do think that's one benefit to coaching versus the therapy model, because I do bring myself into it. I do share some of my experiences, because that way the idea is for them to go, oh, okay, well, I relate to that. Like, I can relate to that experience, or I can say, well, I didn't go along with this or that. And, well, you know, and so it kind of like plant seeds of challenging some of these ideas that they've been indoctrinated into. But I don't come out swinging, you know, I mean, not initially anyway.
Well, with teenagers, it's better not to.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So, but yeah, and it's about them exploring who they are and learning about who they are, which is like what coming of age is all about. Becoming an adult, that's what it's all about. So I'm just here to support them in their own development.
And I suspect the model of life coach might catch on in places where these where therapies are banned, where therapists are required to affirm kids. I suspect that there are going to be therapists who kind of relabel themselves as life coaches in order to be able to work with these kids.
Maybe. I mean, I'm the first one that I know of. And, you know, I was in communication with some therapists, and I was like, and I was encouraged to go into this. But I'm not a licensed, you know, social worker. I'm not, you know, so the problem is, if you're a licensed practitioner, and, you know, it could be a nurse practitioner, it could be a therapist, a counselor, psychiatrist, psychologist, you know, a pastoral counselor. If you're licensed under any state regulatory board, you have to abide by those laws, the gender affirming or the, you know, anti-conversion therapy laws. So if you're a licensed practitioner, you're beholden to those laws. So
and yeah, so it's interesting if someone can renounce their licensure in order to become a life coach. That'll be the question. Yeah.
They can, and they can let it expire is the other way to go about it. Yeah.
Isn't that just insane that somebody would have to actually let their professional credentials expire in order to help these kids?
Yeah.
Well, I really am thankful that you are out there working with these kids, and I appreciate you sharing your experiences and insights. It's been really, I've enjoyed it a lot, and I've learned a lot from your background. So thank you for sharing.